How are you guys all doing? Welcome into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege. Yes, if you've noticed, I'm in a new location. I'd like to keep you guys on your toes a little bit when I'm doing this show, switch it around a little bit. Maybe only for Wednesdays I'm going to be in this location. But on today's show, anyway, I'm going to be talking about a lot of interesting stuff. Obviously, the biggest news breaking today on Stefon Diggs and the trade. I'm going to give you guys my reactions to that a little bit later on in the show. I'm also going to start off with the Los Angeles Chargers and what they plan on doing with that number 5 overall pick and how it might not be so obvious what they're going to do with the pick after so much speculation and anticipation over what's going to happen with that. I'm going to get into that, as well as giving you guys my predictions on 4 new playoff teams that I think we could be seeing in the playoffs next season. All of that and more on today's show, so stick around. You're not going to want to miss any of that stuff. Before I start on the first segment, as always, please like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, as well as the channel itself. And one last reminder, if you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, please make sure to use the tip and donations link running across the ticker below with any questions or comments that you may have. I'm able to read your question on air, and we could have a discussion, take the conversation elsewhere. It makes it more fun, a bit more engaging for me, and I think everybody watching the show. So if you're able to do that, a big thank you to you. Again, the tip and donations link is GSMCpodcast.net. So moving on to the first topic of the day, surrounding the Chargers and what they're going to do with that number 5 overall pick. It's interesting because all you really hear nowadays is the Chargers talking about, or analysts talking about the Chargers, that number 5 pick. It's looking to be a receiver, or the Chargers are going to go most likely offense, right? Justin Herbert, all of his weapons are now gone. His weapons that he threw to last year aren't all there. Eckler, Keenan Allen, and all those players are now gone. You look at what they've done so far in free agency, they've really just done a lot of housekeeping so far in free agency, fixing their salary cap, trying to get the best players to stay and cutting ties with others. Keenan Allen, like I mentioned already, Eckler, some of those guys. They were able to keep Bosa and Khalil Mack, which is good. I think it's what Jim Harbaugh wants to do. But anyway, looking at this Chargers pick now at number 5, it's seriously put more into question, at least for me, reading all the reports and other news that I've seen come out around the Chargers, is that based on what Jim Harbaugh is as a coach, based on what people know about him, looking at his Michigan team and looking at his identity that he wants to build with this team, a lot of it is built through the trenches. A lot of it is beating people up, physical, owning the game, controlling the game that way. The running game is a big part of that. And now you look at the number 5 pick, and the way Jim Harbaugh spoke about the O-line at the NFL coaches meeting, I think says a lot more than people really realize. At the annual meeting, Jim Harbaugh said, "If I asked you the question of what position group depends on no other position group to be good, but every other position group depends on them to be good, what position group is that? Offensive line." And I've never really seen him speak so highly of the offensive line so far in just this offseason. Yeah, he keeps it lighthearted, he jokes around a lot, but he seemed very serious when he said that statement. And offensive line is a big part of, obviously, the success of all of these teams. The best teams have great offensive lines, and it lines up with what Jim Harbaugh, his identity is. And just on that, looking at the Chargers offensive line last year, you say that, yeah, the offensive line's important, but the weapons are equally as important for Justin Herbert, your franchise quarterback. That makes sense. Looking at the Chargers just last season, they were pretty good in pass protection. Justin Herbert only sacked 29 times, ranked 3rd or 23rd in the NFL. rushing yards weren't really there. That's really where the caveat is in all of this, the kind of coach that Jim Harbaugh is. You see the rush yards last year for the Chargers, and I think that's a big point of emphasis that Jim Harbaugh wants to switch up here. In rushing alone last year, they had only 1,642 yards. That was 25th in the NFL. Less than 100 yards per game on average. And it goes without saying all the struggles that Austin Eckler had, not only through injury of himself and his own, fault in that and his own contributions to that, missing time and not really gaining a rhythm, but a majority of that is that offensive line. He was their leading rusher, and he had 628 yards as their lead back. That ranked 38th in the league, guys. 38th for your lead running back that missed a lot of time. You're not going to get anywhere with those sort of numbers, honestly, in reality, with the kind of competition that there is in the AFC. As well, you look at Michigan with Jim Harbaugh just this past season. Blake Corum was 7th in rushing attempts at 258, led all of college football with 27 rushing touchdowns. And when you look at Michigan and the way that they're built, their offensive line is huge. Their offensive line is an actual, quite literal wall that teams' defenses can't get past. They're maulers. They move well in space, and they created a lot of holes for Blake Corum, and just how well and how successful that team was. Not to mention their defensive line as well was one of the best in all of college football. So both of those lines, there's a reason why those players are spoken so highly of around draft circles and around team circles. Just a lot of anticipation and praise for those guys for what they did. And it was deserved for how they all played out, and they won the national championship and all of that. But the biggest thing is to remember here, I don't think it's so cut and dry. I know Herbert needs a weapon, and I know Justin Herbert, you think about him, just now that I brought it up, if you go offensive line, if you're Justin Herbert, are you questioning that a little bit? Thinking about it, if I'm Justin Herbert, I want weapons. I want someone to throw the ball to, but at the same time, it's still helping you with the offensive line at number 5, or if they trade back a little bit and still get another prospect that they really like. There's a bit of good and bad with it. I'm interested to see what he would react to. It is a good question just because it's positive either way, but it's positive if you already have good wide receivers and you draft O-line, no one's saying anything. If you have a great O-line and you draft a receiver, no one's saying anything either. So that's where right now I'm thinking of if I'm Justin Herbert. Also, they have the number 5 pick, and the best offensive line prospect that's been touted so far has been Joe Alt. And all the mock drafts, if you go out there and see them, look for them, most of them have Joe Alt going no earlier really than number 7 for the Tennessee Titans. They also need offensive line help, so that makes sense. Like I mentioned, everyone thinks the Chargers are going wide receiver, but the way Jim Harbaugh speaks about it, what if Joe Alt is taking number 5? Is that too high for Joe Alt? I don't know how people view him, if they think top 5 is too high for him. In my opinion, I don't think really any pick is too early for an offensive lineman. They are so pivotal in the success of these teams. I agree with Jim Harbaugh, but I agree because most teams have wide receivers, have weapons. No team has the level of wide receivers that the Chargers currently do right now. And number 5, to pick Joe Alt would affect a lot of things. Then you look at the Tennessee Titans, what they would do in case Joe Alt isn't there. Would they move back? Or would it make sense for the Chargers just to move back? Maybe they don't like Joe Alt. Maybe they like another prospect, and this makes it better for them to trade back from number 5 to, say, 11, 12 with the Broncos or the Minnesota Vikings with that pick. They could still get a Talise Fuaga or a Troy Fatano from Washington. If they like one of those two guys better, it makes sense, and I think it would work out better for them, but, they might like Joe Alt. And if they could get him at 5, no one before them is going to take him most likely, unless another team trades up, but that would be most likely for a quarterback. So they could take him at number 5, and that would be fine, but there is just those other thoughts that come into your head of, well, when are you going to address wide receiver? I actually saw mock draft today that had them trading back with I want to say it was the Arizona Cardinals. Or no, it was the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings, they traded both of their picks away. They move back to number 11, get one of those tackles that I mentioned, and they still get the 23rd pick where they can draft another wide receiver. I thought that was a great idea. If it works out like that, that would be the best case scenario, in my opinion. And the last thing I will say is, if they don't do that and draft Joe Alt at number 5, their general manager, Joe Ortiz, has said that he expects a big second-year leap from their rookie wide receiver last season, Quentin Johnson, out of TCU. A lot was said about him coming into the draft. He was one of the highly rated receivers. Didn't really work out for him in his first year. He had a lot of drops and not a lot of positives. A lot of learning came from that first season, but he didn't really show out like all other wide receivers tend to surprise in their first season. Not to say that he can't, but, he hasn't proven it. So what are you going to base the thought off of? If he hasn't proven it, you're still hoping to see it. He hasn't shown you any real flashes. Maybe in practice or something like that, but in the games, in my opinion, from watching the Chargers a good amount, he didn't really pop out too much in separation, catches, creating space between a cornerback. Those sort of things I didn't really see from him, but, there could be a second-year jump. I just don't know if the Chargers are willing to gamble all of that on just hoping that it happens for him. And even still, if he has a monster year, they still would need a few more weapons, I would hope, for Justin Herbert to throw the ball around. They can't just run it the whole game with Gus Edwards, and he isn't the greatest running back, so again, you might need somebody else to spot Gus Edwards and come in for him, and you might need a running back room to really blossom that running game. A lot of options still left on the table for the Chargers to figure out. It seems like Jim Harbaugh wants to build this offensive lineup and build this offense through the run. It makes sense because Justin Herbert's thrown a lot, but right now there is more questions and a lot more hoping and guessing than there are solid answers. That'll all play out over the course of these next few 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out. I'm sure Jim Harbaugh won't be shy about keeping it entertaining, but that is all in development as of right now. But in the meantime, we're going to move on with the show. And moving on with the show, I have a lot more to talk about. I mentioned the Stefon Diggs trade I'm going to get into. That's towards the end of the show. On the other side of the break, I'm going to talk about the Baltimore Ravens and John Harbaugh this time, and how he is actually welcoming the input of his star quarterback, Lamar Jackson, with any ideas that Lamar might have in regards to the NFL draft coming up in just a few weeks. Stick around to find out what John Harbaugh said and what Lamar Jackson can bring to the table in terms of the NFL draft. That and much more coming on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.